give you an opportunity to say a few words.
Well, what's off the... yes, this will be straight off the top of my head, right? I was expecting that I'd be responding to questions, but here we go. Listening to Daniel and also to Colin, it's very interesting. Perhaps I should explain why I'm here at all. I guess I probably am the only person in the room who was at the first ever meeting of the G20. And that is, of course, when it was a finance ministers forum, finance ministers and central bank governors. And at that time I was very heavily involved in the work of the G20, but I was, I guess, even more heavily involved in the work that led to the establishment of the G20. And one thing that, and I was also, I guess I played a role in, although behind the scenes, in the G20 morphing to a leaders forum, because for most things it was me who said to Kevin Rudd, look, I really think you need to get the G20 elevated to leaders. And I think it is the case that without Kevin Rudd's intervention that would not have happened. So I guess that's why I'm here. But now to get to your question or your invitation, you know, one thing that strikes me is how little things change. I think, you know, the very first item that was on the agenda of the very first G20 ministers meeting was reform of the international financial organisations and particularly the International Monetary Fund, and it was agreed to. And we're now 15 years later and we're still talking about it. And the problem that we had in 1999 when we were talking about the need for the G20, the problem we had was largely, and let's be frank about it, the US, and that continues to be the problem today. The Americans knew it then, they've known it in all of the intervening years, they certainly know it today. This is a big issue for all of us. It is true that Australia has played more of a role in ensuring a better voice for a larger set of countries in the IMF than I suspect almost any other country. I mean, we took a decision unilaterally ourselves to share our particular constituency with South Korea. We didn't have to do that. We were in a position where we were the leaders of our constituency, but we decided that we would share our constituency leadership with South Korea. I'm not aware of any other constituency leader in the IMF doing that. So we've probably pushed about as hard as we can, which isn't to say that anybody should regard this piece of work as something that is not worth pursuing. It's absolutely necessary. The G20, just to stress a couple of points that Daniel made, the G20 was never established as a representative body, and that is really, really important. And in fact, it was seen at the time that it was established that one of the risks with it pretending to be representative would be that over time its membership would grow, and what do you know, that is exactly what's happened. And the reason that people were concerned about that was because, well, we had the IMF. The IMF has the full membership. Or if it doesn't have full membership, the United Nations certainly does. And the observation that was made back in 1999 when we were talking about setting this thing up was that the broader the membership of the organisation, the less effective. Now that's broadly correct even today. The broader the membership, the less effective. And what we wanted was an organisation which was representative of issues, not representative of countries, and that is why, and Daniel observed this, it's got the membership of the G20 has an important north-south and east-west component to it. That was quite deliberate in the design and the selection of the countries that would be members of the G20. It is not, just finally on growth and then on development and particularly regional outreach, it's not surprising at this point in time we would see the G20 banging the drum on growth. Why are they doing it? It seems to me, and I don't actually know because I've not been involved in discussions, G20 discussions in recent years for obvious reasons, and I haven't even had detailed conversations behind the scenes with people who have been heavily involved at the reason, so in recent times. But let me tell you how it looks to me then as an observer from the outside who understands the way the G20 has worked. It looks to me that as a group on growth is saying to the United States and the European Union, and particularly the Eurozone, you guys need to confront your demons. And in the United States, that's principally commentary about the US Congress. And in the European Union, well, it's a repetition of commentary that every international economic and financial organisation has made about Europe since probably the 1970s, which is basically that it's a continent in need of radical reform. I'm quite pessimistic about that, but we can talk about prospects in both the United States and Europe, but we can talk about that later if you're interested. The Chinese, for example, do not need to be lectured by the G20 or anybody else about economic growth. After all, they have been contributing probably half of the world's growth for a very long period of time now themselves. But it's really a message to the US and to Europe, as I read it. On development, we've got a big problem here. It is the one that Colin referred to, which is really that for all of the G20's efforts, the G20 is most effective at time of crisis and in responding to crisis. And what we have in respect of development, particularly in the region, and Colin I think set this out very well, is that we have slow-moving crisis. There's never a sufficient sense of urgency for a body like the G20 to get sufficiently motivated to say this is the number one issue confronting the world. And that is, I think that's a big problem. It's a big problem in development generally, but particularly in the Pacific.
Thanks, Ken. Time for questions, friends, colleagues. Show of hands. Who wants to go first? Steve.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, all the speakers. My name's Stephen Howes. I'm at the Crawford School at the Development Policy Centre. I wanted to ask Colin, you said you called for a revision of the development architecture in the Pacific, and I'd like to draw you out on that and just ask you, what do you mean by that? In particular, what are the implications for organisations, including your own, of such a revision? And if I could ask Daniel, I was struck, you mentioned maybe 10, if not 20 issues that the G20 was going to address. But although you had terms like sustainability and resilience, climate change didn't feature as one of them. And I think, we had Greg Hunt here before the election saying that he was going to use the G20 to drive a deal on climate change. And I appreciate you're not a politician, but I'd still like to ask you, has climate change ever featured in the G20, and why not? It does seem to be, unlike many other issues like growth, where countries have plenty of incentives themselves, this is one we actually do need collective action.
Well, thank you. Firstly, thanks for putting the plug in on climate change. I was hoping that get picked up. It's a big issue for this part of the world. But in terms of the architecture, let me start at its very basic level. When we convene a meeting, or there's a meeting being convened in this part of the world, UN agencies have a certain level of support for participants that come to meetings. And SPC regional organizations struggle because we get asked about why is it that there's a difference between these organizations' support for people attending, and I say that because it's at its very basic level. There are these discrepancies which I think are inefficient. But let's go back up to my starting point. I was staggered by the $237 per capita in this part of the world, and the next closest was $38, $39 in Africa. And it got me thinking about surely there's something seriously wrong here. And then I started to dig around, and there's all the There's the international organizations that have a very strong presence in the region, and their agenda is set in Geneva and New York. It's not a Pacific agenda. Why do I say that? Let me give you an example from my own technical area. Despite the dire warnings in the last decade or so about HIV/AIDS, it remains a low prevalence region, very low prevalence with the exception of Papua New Guinea and maybe French Polynesia. And yet we have this global fund that pours money into the three diseases, HIV/AIDS, TB and malaria. And the Pacific benefits, don't get me wrong. But by and large, that's not our public health problem. Our public health problem is diabetes and heart disease. But I actually have no money to seriously tackle this issue in the region. 3 out of every 4 deaths in this part of the world is from diabetes and heart disease. And you might say, well, isn't that individual responsibility and all of that? Yes, of course, that's part of the issue. The point I'm making is here's a global decision on a fund dedicated to a particular set of issues that are clearly important in other places, but not in this part of the world. Meantime, we're struggling to mobilize resources to address the real issues that we have. So that's an example. But my own sense of it is that there are lots and lots and lots of organizations, and frankly, despite people say, I don't think the impact is as good as you might expect. And I'm simply raising the question, is there a better way? And one way, from my point of view, is perhaps to have a conductor for the orchestra. And that instead of all the international and regional organizations all competing for airtime in the small islands, perhaps simplify that. Have one agency, 2 agencies, a partnership of the right mix that are fundamental in the relationship with the countries to make things work, to identify accountability measures and to report to the development partners and to the countries and to everybody about what is being achieved. So I do think there's a problem around complexity, lack of clarity about who does what, and more importantly, there's actually no accountability. Absolutely no accountability, effective accountability. So at least we know what's going on, where the money that was allocated, how was it spent, and what did we achieve? So it's a mixed response. It clearly needs, I think it's an issue worth debating some more, personally.
Daniel.
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. I'm not a politician, but I can give you, I think, a fairly good explanation. Firstly, I'd note the PM and others have noted that climate change is an issue, but it's one of many that he wants to tackle and Australia has an interest in. The key point, I think, is that in St. Petersburg, the leaders agreed for this year that the key priorities would be jobs and growth, or growth and jobs, whichever way you wish to put around it, and that growth was fundamental to development, and that's why we'd focus on that going forward. I think it's worth observing also that the organisation is a consensus-based one, so we need to find 2 or 3 key issues where we can achieve that consensus and drive change. On climate change, in terms of what has occurred in the past, we've seen political statements in each of the leaders' communiques, but in terms of substantive work going forward, the main focus has been on climate change financing, and that's continuing.
I also like to thank the 2 speakers for the very informative talk. My name is Li Gangsong from Crawford School. And my question is about the role of human capital development, human capital and the resources. Colin provided a very striking figure, a statistic, which is out of 7 out of 10 children not going beyond, primary education. And Daniel also provided a very striking figure, 600 million people, young people, either not working or studying. So this is actually the core of the issue for development. Either we related to the institution and others, but we are not empowering people for development. So I'm wondering about, from a South Pacific point of view, how government can do, or even private sector, to get message across.
We don't know what's happened to the mics today. They're misbehaving.
Yeah, about importance of education, especially at that level. Thanks. So back to the to Daniel's the chart. So it's not just empower development, but empower people for development. Thanks.
I suppose that's why I pointed out that you can't talk about improvements in health or improvements in the creation of wealth or development or anything when your basic building block is flawed, deeply flawed. And again, I think this is probably a manifest. There's no shortage of money. The first regional meeting of ministers of education and our strategy took place in the mid-90s. And we're probably worse off now than we were then. The cynic in me might say, well, there's a clear correlation between ministers meeting and performance of schools. But anyway, so I do think it's a serious issue for us in the region because it's hard enough competing for a job when you've got an education. But if you haven't got an education in an otherwise bleak landscape for employment, you haven't got a hope. And so not only you have to look again at the education sector in the region and what's going on, but I also think we need to look at labour mobility as a real opportunity and an option for this part of the world. You can only catch so much tuna, and you can only be a tour guide for so many tourists. But unless the internet and access to the internet is real and efficient and effective and cheap, affordable, and you've got an educated population, where are you heading? You're heading nowhere in a hurry. And as I say, I can speak freely about education because I can say we haven't been involved in that space up until this point in time. But seriously, I see it as, apart from NCDs, as the other big one for the region, and I think we need to look seriously at a number of levels and who's involved. It's easy to say, well, it's a national responsibility, and we know a big country in this part of the world that's handing out money to other parts of the world and giving money to us, and I'm torn. I'm in a dilemma. Should I accept this gift, or should I say, please use it to educate your own children? So there's some fundamental questions for us as leaders for the Pacific region, quite apart from all the global stuff that has an impact on us, but we do have some serious conversations about this very issue, about education and its effectiveness, about skills, about opportunities for young people. I made mention as an example, the Marshall Islands, 3 out of 4 young persons, 15 to 24, don't have a job. So it's a real issue. And that's why I'm arguing for a rethink, a regroup, perhaps a revision of the architecture and how this ODA allocation, and it's not the only thing I might add, but it's nonetheless an important contribution to development in this part of the world.
Ken and Daniel, Ken, you want to come in on this?
Just
Brave the microphone.
Yeah. Just this really is a simplistic observation, which is that, and it's intended to be so, which is that the way in which countries develop is driven by the factors of production that they have. Now, these could be natural resources, and maybe they don't make the best use of them. As Colin pointed out this morning, a lot are not making the best use of their tuna resources. But then Australia doesn't make the best use of its iron ore and coal resources either. Matter of fact, I'm not sure we get any more in royalties from our, as a share, coal and iron ore than Pacific Islands get from tuna, by the way, and that's an issue. But they could be naturally occurring factor endowments, or they could be created endowments. They could be factors of production which have been developed indigenously, right, by the local population. In that respect, Singapore provides a marvellous example for a lot of countries in the region. Now, you could say, well, Singapore has a fantastic natural endowment, which is locational advantage, and clearly it does, right? It's got a hub location that many other countries in the region would be very, very pleased to have. But Singapore has done much more than that. And it has focused very, very heavily on education, right? If you want high-paid jobs for your population, it's all very well to sit and wring your hands and say there are no high-paid jobs. By the way, I had a very interesting conversation with a very senior education official in China when I was undertaking consultations on Australia and the Asian century. I'll never forget this fellow saying to me, "We have a problem. We are presently graduating 6 million people from university a year. Why is that a problem?" He said, "The jobs don't exist. All of these people go to university thinking that they're going to graduate into a white-collar job. Instead, they're having to find blue-collar jobs. There's some resentment building." And the conversation I then had with him was very much the chicken and egg conversation, right? I mean, you won't have the white-collar jobs unless you've got people who can do white-collar jobs. So what do? Do you, worrying about the potential for middle-class unrest, do you say, "Oh, well, we're not going to educate our people"? The senior Chinese official gave the right answer to that. He said, "Well, that would be absurd. We have no choice but to educate our people because we know what sort of economy we want. We know what sort of jobs we want our people to have. It's an obvious answer. There is no substitute for educating people."
My comments are probably a little bit more broad, only in the sense that employment will feature as one of the actions that individual governments will take this year within the G20, and that'll include skills, training, labour and so on. But it doesn't go to, it can go to national education policies, but that's really up to each individual government. In terms of development, it's not a stream at the moment that's been identified where the G20 can add value. We've deliberately narrowed down from 14 to 5 the streams of work at the moment to try to be more effective. But there is a discussion in terms of MDGs and SDGs through workshops this year, and how perhaps at the end of the year we may be able to support the UN process, not interfere in it, but support it, and there is a question of timing there, and that will go to some aspects of education.
Terry Dwyer, Dwyer Lawyers. I have a couple of paradoxes perhaps for Daniel. I noticed the G20 wants to promote trade and investment. Now, if one wants to promote trade, presumably one would be abolishing trade monopolies through patent and IP laws rather than extending them. They didn't exist in the early 19th century, in the period of the world's greatest economic growth. And for investment, obviously investment in physical capital depends on tax rates, and the optimal tax rate on physical capital is 0. So why are you trying to stop companies internationally minimising their tax rates on mobile capital to get an efficient outcome?
Thank you. On trade, first I'd make the observation that the sort of treaties you're talking about, IP arrangements and so on, are similar, or not all are in the WTO, but many are focused on Geneva. And one of the key points we make is the G20 is not the WTO. It's not a negotiating forum. It's a consensus-based forum. And that may be a paradox, but it means that I think to address some of the issues you're raising would be very difficult, and they're therefore dealt with in other regimes. Each individual government, of course, could always make the decisions you're suggesting, but it wouldn't be within a G20 context. It would be a unilateral move. On investment, tax rates, I don't think the G20 is advocating a particular tax rate or regime. They're advocating transparency and exchange of information. If we have that, that allows governments then to determine themselves what instruments they might put in place to capture, if you wish, tax. And there are very different views within the G20 economies, perhaps, about some of those policies that might be appropriate. What we're looking now at, though, is a consistent form of exchange of information, greater transparency, then allow those decisions to be made. And I mean, the concern is a legitimate one. We have some countries outside the G20 who seek to attract, investment, who are very concerned if they're seen as being in the black area. Our response to that is, if you meet international standards, OECD standards, and you're willing to be transparent, it's up to you.
Other questions? Wait for a moment.
Thanks, and thank you to the speakers. I'm James Ryan. I work for the Utilities Regulatory Authority of Vanuatu. I have a question for Colin and Daniel, and Ken as well if he wants to pitch in, on another paradox between some of the points you made. Colin, you made a very interesting point that I fully agree with on the potential or differences in potential for development, especially in small island nations, such as Vanuatu and across the Pacific. And Daniel, the key point and the priority for the G20 is growth. So how do you think you can reconcile those two issues in a meaningful way?
Let me take the second question. Thanks, James, and then we'll wrap them together. Please.
Thank you. I'm Tanya Morjanoff. I'm a student at ANU and a public servant as well. You've mentioned tax transparency and exchange of information within the G20 countries. I'm just wondering if there's any chance that that information would be shared with developing countries to assist them in recapturing some of their tax base.
Colin.
I guess that's why I made the point that this relentless approach for development in every small place in the Pacific is misguided. It seemed to me that a conversation has to take place about what is a realistic level of development for each of these places. By the way, I regard Vanuatu as having potential. My concern is more the small islands of Micronesia and Polynesia. There must be an acceptable quality of life to be expected in these small places that is short of the quality of life that you can expect in Sydney. I haven't seen any conversation of that type. In other words, can we differentiate better what is possible in A, B, C, D, and E, for example, and then to reshape the conversation accordingly? At the present time, Niue is being pressured by everybody to develop. Is it wise? Is it sensible? Is it necessary? What impact would it have on the environment? Currently, they're operating a bums-on-seats tourism approach, and everybody's going, great, look, the numbers of tourists going through have gone up from here to here. And I'm asking myself, is that the right thing to do? Surely tourism is an option, perhaps of a smaller number of higher value people that are more in tune with the environment. But I'm not a tourism specialist. I am simply making some observations, having come into this role, about the approach we're taking to development in the region. And it links to the G20. There must be things that the G20 can do that benefits everybody, members and non-members. Critique, critical thinking, influence, all of that, which again would benefit these folk that are on a tier one for development, if you like, as opposed to others and at a different place. That's the sort of thinking I'm taking to this, because I just think that for the way it's been going on is perhaps not quite the best way for the region.
Daniel.
Just in terms of the discussion about what is the nature of development, what level of development is appropriate, the point that Colin's made, whether it's in the G20 or elsewhere, I think that's a very valuable discussion, should be had. I'd just make the point, and I think this is implicit in Colin's comments, it needs to involve the countries involved. It's not just a donor-based discussion, it's actually a two-way discussion, and it has to very much react to the expectations and informing those expectations of the people in the countries involved before any significant changes are made. In terms of reconciling the development stream with the sort of growth agenda within the G20, we've worked very hard this year to try to make sure that the areas of focus within the development stream match those that have been taken forward in the other areas of work. The intent there is that's where our expertise lies in terms of the people who are coming to the meetings and can add value, rather than trying to duplicate everything that might be required to lead to development or growth in particular countries or economies or regions. And that's based on the judgment that there are already other groups doing that. As Colin noted, there's a plethora of organisations involved in the Pacific. The G20 may be able to bring some guidance to that, but it could also be seen as crossing lines and interfering in other processes, so it's a matter of consultation there. That's not to say it may not emerge in the future, but it's not there now. If I might just move to the tax question. From our perspective, it's very important that developing countries are involved. The work that I'm talking about in terms of transparency and base erosion profit shifting is based on OECD work, so it will be an international standard. But there is a recognition that not every country is going to be able to meet that standard immediately, and that's where I think a lot of the development work is focused, and we're having discussions actually now about what would be the valuable add-on, if you like, that the G20 may be able to bring there, given it's not a pledging forum? Is it that a number of G20 countries look at the way they implement programs in development in regard to taxation to lead to more effective tax administrations as a building block towards more effective revenue collection, which then may lead to meeting international standards, rather than assuming immediately that some of these economies can meet those standards? Because I think if we make that assumption, we probably impose costs on some of those economies who actually don't have a very large formal sector, if we think about the Pacific particularly.
Ken, last word.
Oh, well, just that I've been very impressed listening to both Colin and Daniel, and particularly Colin's response to that last question. I think it's the first time I've ever heard anybody in a public forum venture that proposition, but that is precisely the proposition that we need to be focusing on. We need to be asking ourselves that question: what is an appropriate level of development? By the way, not just in countries, but also if you think about a country the size of Australia, in regions, and we confront some of our own demons with respect to Indigenous development issues in Australia, and few people are prepared to ask questions of that gravity in respect of Indigenous development issues in Australia. But throughout the region, it is very much the question, I think, that we need to be focusing on. We need to have the courage to have a conversation on that question. That's all I'd say.
Friends, colleagues, so one quick one. Bob, a quick one.
Thank you. Bob Warner from the Crawford School. I'd like to ask Colin about another quite controversial statement that he slipped in to his presentation, and that was the need to rethink capacity. And it's related to the other issues that we've been talking about in terms of development levels and the role of development partners. But you said it's time to rethink the nature of capacity building and what kind of capacity should be supplied or provided to countries to enable them to deliver the functions of government. I'm just wondering if you'd like to elaborate a little bit on what you have in mind.
Oh, it goes pretty much to this notion I had about appropriate development for individual members, small islands, depending on development potential, cultural expectations, relationships, etc. In other words, a more differentiated approach to development around the Pacific, rather than this blanket approach that we've been pushing for the last few years, certainly as far as I can see. And capacity building is just an aspect of that. So in Papua New Guinea, in the Solomon Islands, in Vanuatu, Samoa, Tonga possibly, sure, by all means, build capacity. Wherever you can, go for it. But you know, is it realistic to try to build capacity in small places? The answer is no. There will be an awful lot of spend, an awful lot of hopes and expectations unrealized. So let me give you an example. There are 3 vets in this part of the world, veterinary scientists who are Pacific. They're around the place. And we've said to people, and we've offered the matching service, it's nonsensical for people to believe that they can sustain professionally and financially a vet in all of these places. It just doesn't make sense. Meantime, we can do this. We can match, what's the word? It's like a locum service, if you like, for those of you who have a medical health background. So instead of Tuvalu trying to have their own vet, that it's difficult to see how they can sustain them because they're going to go off to Australia or somewhere else, use this as a mechanism. In other words, stop pretending that we're building capacity. But in saying that, somebody has to pay for that service as a regional public good, if you like, that this is something we have to do. And let's stop pretending that we're building capacity for veterinary science in Tuvalu. Same for a lot of the challenges we see in the medical sector. But you know, that's what I mean by build capacity where you can, substitute capacity when required, and let's just accept that for some small places it's actually substitution, I should say, forever in the day, or at least for as long as I can see, unless some technology or some smart intervention might help us deliver that service. It's I would have thought common sense and practical approach, but somehow hasn't quite happened that way.